Montana Territory, 1878. The wind howled across the high plains like it knew Delia Bradbury's heart had just cracked wide open. She stood outside the whitewashed church in Dry Willow, the hem of her wedding dress soaked with mud, her veil hanging limp around her shoulders. People were still gathered inside, murmuring confusion, but all Delia could hear was the echo of the sheriff's words. "He is not who he says he is, Miss Bradbury. The man calling himself Thomas Laird is wanted in Wyoming and Utah for fraud and theft. He has a wife and 2 children in Boise. We are arresting him now." Delia's legs had not buckled. She wished they had. She had nodded once, turned on her heel, and walked straight out of the church. No one stopped her. She did not cry. Not yet. By the time the sun was lowering behind the hills, she had changed into her riding clothes and saddled her mare, Juniper. Her hands were steady. Her bag was light, just enough food, a blanket, her journal, and a Colt she had never had to use. She left her wedding ring in the dust outside the church door. Delia did not know where she was going, only that she would not stay. The road west was rough and empty. She rode into the hills without glancing back toward Dry Willow. The sky turned lavender and gold, and her sorrow stayed locked behind her ribs. He had lied. He had lied about everything: his name, his past, his promises. She had given him her trust, and he had tossed it aside like a worn coat. She rode until night pressed in and the stars blinked through the black. She made a small camp, started a fire, and sat beside it, hugging her knees. Juniper huffed nearby. The night air was sharp. Delia wrapped her blanket around her shoulders and stared into the flames. No tears. Not yet. 3 days later, she was deep into the Bitterroot Range, where the land rolled wild and the trails narrowed to deer paths. She passed a burned-out homestead, a broken wagon wheel, and the bones of a steer left to rot in the grass. The wind here spoke in low, mournful tones. By the 4th day, she was lost. Juniper was tired, and so was Delia. Her food had run out that morning, and her canteen was nearly dry. She had followed a creek into a narrow canyon, hoping it would lead her out, but it ended in a wall of rock. She turned the mare around, heart thumping. That was when she heard the gunshot, cracked through the trees like a whip. Then another. A man's voice shouted something she could not make out. Delia froze. Then, without thinking, she nudged Juniper forward toward the sound. The trail curved and opened into a small rise above a narrow valley. Below, in a stand of pine, 3 men on horseback had surrounded a covered wagon. A woman was screaming. A child cried out. One of the men fired into the air again. Delia's breath caught. She slid off Juniper and crawled forward on her elbows, keeping low. Her heart pounded. She counted 1 rifle held by a man with a red scarf and 2 pistols. In the wagon, she saw a woman holding 2 children close. One of them was a girl, maybe 8. The other, a boy, younger. They looked terrified. Delia did not think. She moved. She crept down the embankment, staying behind brush, her Colt drawn. When she was close enough, she stood and called out, "Drop your weapons." The men turned, startled. One cursed. "Who the hell?" "I said drop them," she shouted, gun steady in her hands. "You fire again, I will shoot." The man with the rifle lifted it toward her. That was his mistake. A 4th shot rang out louder, closer, and the rifleman dropped like a stone. Delia's eyes snapped to the trees behind the wagon. A tall man emerged, rifle still raised, face grim under a weathered hat. His coat was dusty, and his eyes were sharp and pale blue. "Get away from the wagon," he barked at the 2 remaining men. They hesitated, then took off, riding hard into the trees. The man didn't chase them. He lowered his rifle, eyes flicking to Delia, then the wagon. "You all right?" he called out. The woman inside the wagon nodded shakily. "Yes, thank you." Delia stepped forward, breathing hard. Her hands were shaking now. The man turned to her. "You all right?" She nodded. "Yes." He walked toward her, not fast, but steady. He stopped a few feet away, watching her carefully. "You handled yourself back there. I had to, she said. They were going to hurt them. I know. He extended his hand. Callum Oakes. She took it. Delia Bradbury. His grip was strong and warm. She let go first. Callum looked at her horse, then the pack she carried. You out here alone? I am. You lost. She hesitated. I suppose I am now. He studied her for a long second, then nodded. You can ride with me for a bit. I was headed west, but I know the land. We can get these folks to safety first. Delia looked past him at the wagon. The woman was hugging her children close. The boy, his name was Noah, she learned later, peered over his mother's shoulder, eyes wide but curious. All right, she said quietly. Thank you. Callum tipped his hat. Let's get moving. It's going to get cold before long. They rode until dusk, the wagon creaking behind them. Callum rode beside her, quiet but alert. He kept checking the trees, his rifle across his lap. Delia felt safe with him, more than she had since she left Dry Willow. They made camp in a clearing near the river. Delia helped gather wood and Callum built the fire. The children ate what food the family had left and then curled under blankets. Their mother, her name was Edith, thanked them both, voice trembling. Later, when the fire was low, Delia sat beside it, staring into the flames again. Callum sat across from her, carving something from a piece of wood. You are good with that, she said softly. He looked up. Gives my hands something to do when my mind is full. Is it? She asked. Full? I mean, he gave a small nod. Always. Delia looked at him. The firelight made the lines of his face gentler. He seemed older than her, maybe in his 30s, but there was no bitterness in his eyes. Just quiet, steady strength. I was supposed to be married, she said suddenly. 4 days ago. He lied to me, lied about everything. Callum did not look away. I am sorry. I left. Took my horse and went. You did the right thing. She blinked, surprised by how sure he sounded. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees. A man who lies like that does not deserve you. Delia's throat tightened. She looked back at the fire. I did not think anyone would help me, she whispered. You helped them, Callum said. That counts for something. She looked at him again. This time he smiled, small but real. Delia felt the warmth of it settle deep in her chest. She smiled back, and for the first time in days she felt something other than loss. Something like hope. By morning, frost clung to the tall grass like lace, brittle and pale in the early light. Edith's boy stirred first, his small hand reaching from beneath the blanket to touch the ground, then jerking back at the cold. Delia, already up, crouched by the fire pit, coaxing the embers back to life with a piece of dried pine and steady breath. She didn't speak, but when the boy's eyes met hers, she offered him a piece of jerky from her saddlebag. He took it without a word, chewing solemnly. Callum emerged from the trees, sleeves rolled, hair damp from the river. He carried a bundle of kindling and a rabbit slung over his shoulder. Found traps full, he said, setting the wood down. We'll eat proper this morning. Edith pressed her hand to her chest in quiet relief. You've done too much already. Callum shook his head. Not enough yet. You're still too close to what happened. He skinned the rabbit with practiced movements, hands sure but unhurried. Delia watched him, noting the faint scar along his forearm and the way he didn't look up when people spoke. He listened with his whole body, head tilted slightly, always still. They ate in silence, the kind that didn't press. Delia hadn't known quiet could feel this companionable. When the sun cleared the treetops, the group packed the wagon and readied the horses. Callum tied the rabbit pelts behind his saddle. You know these parts well? Delia asked as they began riding, wagon wheels creaking behind them. Well enough, he said. Spent 5 years trading out of Missoula. Learned the land by necessity. Why'd you stop? My partner took a bullet over a whiskey debt. After that, I didn't see the use in selling powder and nails to men who couldn't keep their tempers. Delia rode beside him a while, letting the rhythm of the trail fill the spaces he left untouched. The terrain thickened with lodgepole pine and low brush, the path narrowing into switchbacks that forced the wagon to move slow and careful. That afternoon, a thin trickle of smoke rose between 2 ridges ahead. Callum pulled up his horse. "Trapper's camp," he said. "If they're decent, they'll have salt and flour to spare." He dismounted, tied his reins, and looked to Delia. "You coming? I ought to stay with Edith." "Suit yourself." But after a beat, she swung down too, trailing him as they walked beneath the trees. The smoke came from a small fire ringed with stones. Two men leaned over it, one stirring a pot, the other oiling a trap. They looked up when Callum and Delia stepped into view. "Friendly?" Callum asked, voice even. "Depends what you're after," said the older of the two, his beard patchy with gray. "Trade. We've got pelts, need some supplies." The younger trapper squinted at Delia. "She yours?" "No, that was all," Callum said. No explanation, no apology. They traded swiftly 2 pelts for a sack of flour and a small tin of salt. As they turned to go, the older trapper called out, "Watch the North Pass. Heard there's been movement group of men running off stock, stirring up trouble. You heading west?" "Eventually. Then steer south at the split. Keeps you clear." Callum nodded once, then turned back down the slope. Delia followed, her boots crunching frostbitten needles. When they reached the trail again, she asked, "You always that quiet with strangers?" He glanced sideways. "I talk when there's need. And if there's not, then I listen." They rode on. The trail bent westward out of the pines and into open country again. The wagon creaked behind them, Edith singing low to soothe the children as they dozed. Delia found herself watching the land more than the people. The horizon here felt like it breathed. The peaks in the distance held snow even now, while the valleys below were just starting to show the gold blush of late summer grass. She'd grown up near Helena, but this country was rougher, less touched. It made her feel small in a way that was not unkind. That evening they camped near a stream, the water shallow and quick between smooth stones. Callum built a small spit for cooking, and Delia gathered yarrow and wild mint growing along the banks. She crushed the leaves between her fingers, releasing their scent. "You know plants?" he asked when she returned with a bundle. "Some. My mother kept a still room. Taught me what to use for aches and fevers." He nodded, taking the mint from her. "You'll be useful if you stay on the trail long." She knelt beside the fire, laying out the herbs to dry. "I haven't decided where I'm going." "Then take your time." She looked up. "You always this patient with strangers?" Callum's eyes met hers, sharper than before. No, she didn't look away. "So why me?" He didn't answer right away. Then, "Because you stayed when it got hard." Delia felt her jaw tighten. Not from anger, something more fragile than that. She sat back, crossing her arms. "You don't know anything about me." "I will," he said, then turned his attention to the fire. Later, when the children were asleep and Edith had curled beneath the wagon with a wool blanket, Delia walked to the edge of camp. Callum stood there already, watching the moon rise over the hills. Without looking at her, he said, "You're not afraid of much." She stepped beside him. I was afraid of being alone, of being wrong. I thought marrying him would fix that. And now, I'm still alone." She paused, then added, "But I'd rather be alone for the right reasons than with someone for the wrong ones." He nodded once, as if marking something down in his mind. The silence between them stretched, not empty, but full of things that didn't need speaking. When she turned to go, he said, "There's a ranch near the valley bend. Belongs to a widow named Hester. She boards travelers when the pass gets rough. We'll stop there. Give Edith and her children a rest." Delia hesitated. "And you?" "I never stay long anywhere." She didn't ask why. She only said, "All right," and walked back to camp. But that night, lying beneath her blanket with the stars spinning slow above her, Delia thought about the way he had said "I will." Not a promise, a quiet certainty. And for the first time since she'd left Dry Willow, she wanted to stay long enough to be known. The trail to Hester's ranch bent south along a dry creek, where sun-bleached cottonwoods leaned over trickling water and the air smelled of dust and sage. Edith's youngest had come down with a fever that morning, his cheeks flushed and his limbs slack in her arms. Delia rode behind the wagon now, keeping watch, her knees aching from the long stretch in the saddle. "They'll need rest," Callum said as he nudged his horse ahead of hers. "And shade." "Hester's got both. She have medicine?" Delia asked, her voice low. "She keeps a root cellar with dried things. Coltsfoot, willow bark, might be enough." The ranch sat in a wide basin at the foot of a low ridge, the house a squat log structure with smoke rising from the chimney and 2 goats grazing near the fence. A girl of about 15 opened the door as they approached, wiping her hands on her skirt. Callum raised his hand. "Is your ma home?" The girl nodded and stepped aside. A moment later, a tall woman with a sun-darkened face and graying braids stepped onto the porch. Her gaze swept over the wagon, then settled on Edith cradling her boy. "Bring him in," she said without pause. "I've got Willow boiled already." Edith didn't speak. She just climbed down, eyes shining with exhaustion, and followed the woman inside. Delia stayed with the horses. Callum led them toward the small barn, unfastening tack as he walked. The quiet between them wasn't strained, but it held something new, like both were waiting for the other to speak first. "You ever stay here before?" Delia reached for Juniper's saddle. "Once. Winter 4 years back." "Alone then?" Callum paused, brushing dust from his coat. No, she didn't press. Instead, she led Juniper into the barn, breathing in the scent of hay and dry wood. Callum followed, hanging bridles on a peg near the door. "I reckon Edith'll need a few days here," he said after a while. "You can ride on if you want." Delia ran her hand along Juniper's neck. "And go where?" He didn't answer. When they returned to the house, the girl had brought out bread and a crock of beans. Delia sat on the porch step, letting the warmth of the food settle her. Callum stood leaning against the post, his arms crossed, watching the sun dip behind the slope. "You ever think about settling somewhere?" she asked. He shrugged. "Sometimes. Doesn't sit long." "Why not?" Callum looked down at his boots. "Place starts to feel like yours, then something happens to remind you it ain't." Delia folded her hands in her lap. "That a warning?" "No," he looked at her then. "Just truth." They ate in silence after that, but it was a silence that held shape, like the hush just before rain or the stillness before a bird takes flight. That night, Delia lay on a cot near the hearth, a quilt pulled up to her chest. Across the room, the fire had burned down to coals, and the only sound was the boy's breathing, slower now, steadier. Edith slept in a chair with her head tipped back. Delia turned her face to the wall, the quilt rough against her cheek. She didn't sleep. Not yet. By morning, the boy's fever had broken. Edith wept without sound, her arms wrapped around her son as he clung to her neck. Hester made tea and pressed it into Delia's hands with a nod. No thanks were needed. The air outside was cooler now, touched with the edge of fall. Callum stood at the fence, watching the goats pick their way through the thistle. Delia joined him, steam rising from her tin cup. "She said he'll be all right," Delia murmured. Callum nodded. "Good." She looked past the fields toward the mountains. "You said you were heading west." "I was." Delia kept her eyes on the horizon. "Still are." "I don't know." She turned toward him. "You don't strike me as someone who doesn't know what he wants." He turned his head slowly. "That's so? You seem like a man who makes choices and keeps them." Callum looked down, one hand resting on the fence rail. "I used to be." Delia waited. "I was married once," he said finally. 5 years. She died in the second winter after we settled. Fever took her inside a week. A crow called somewhere near the trees. Delia didn't move. "I stayed another 2 years," he continued. "Didn't speak to anyone unless I had to. Then one day I saddled my horse and left. Been riding since." Delia set her cup down on the fence post between them. "Why'd you tell me?" "Because you're not riding away from something anymore. You're riding towards something, and I can see that." She looked down at her hands, the skin raw from days of rains and campfire heat. "I don't know what I'm looking for. Maybe you're not supposed to know yet." Delia looked up. "And you?" "I think I found it." They stood there a long while, the wind tugging at their sleeves, the land stretching quiet around them. After supper, Hester offered her sewing chair by the hearth to Delia, and she mended a torn shirt sleeve with small, even stitches. Callum sat nearby, whittling a spoon from a scrap of pine. The boy laughed as he played with a bit of twine, and the girl brought in water from the well without being asked. Later, when the others had drifted to sleep, Delia stepped out onto the porch. The moon was thin tonight, but the stars shone bright enough to mark the edges of the hills. Callum joined her without a word, his shoulder brushing hers as he leaned against the post. Delia didn't look at him. "I want to stay a while. I'd like that." She turned then, and he was already watching her. No rush in it, no hunger either. Just something steady and sure. She reached for his hand. He took hers without hesitation, his fingers warm against her chilled skin. They stood like that, the porch creaking beneath their boots, the night holding them both. The days at Hester's ranch stretched wide and slow, stitched together by tasks that asked for quiet hands, mending harnesses, splitting kindling, boiling elderberry syrup for the boy's lingering cough. Delia moved with steady purpose through each one, her sleeves rolled to the elbow, her hair pinned back without fuss. She didn't speak much, but she watched everything: how Hester sprinkled barley into the cooking pot without measuring, how the goats knew to follow her youngest daughter when she carried a pail of oats, how Callum always checked the sky before settling in for the night. One morning, just after the frost began lifting off the fence posts, Callum saddled his horse and rode out without a word. Delia stood on the porch, arms folded, watching the dust rise behind him. He didn't look back. By mid-afternoon, he returned with a rolled oilskin tied behind his saddle and a new scar along his knuckle, thin and red as a thread. "You find trouble?" Delia asked, not looking up from the bundle of carrots she was scrubbing. "Ran into a ranch hand west of the ridge. He'd been riding a stolen bay. Belongs to a family I know near the Flathead line." Her hands slowed. "You take it back?" "Left it with a settler's family who'll see it returned. Too far to ride it myself without letting the trail go cold." She set the brush down. "You think you'll keep riding after Edith's well enough to move on?" Callum glanced toward the barn. "That what you want me to do?" Delia shook her head. "I asked what you plan, not what I prefer." He leaned against the post, thumb hooked under his belt. "I ain't made up my mind. You always wait for things to settle themselves?" He didn't answer right away. "I used to think time fixed most things. Now I think it just gives you space to see them clearer." That evening, the wind shifted. It came down from the bitterroots, sharp and smelling faintly of snow. Hester brought in the last of the apples from the tree behind the barn. Delia helped her slice and dry them near the stove, the air thick with the scent of cinnamon bark. In the quiet, Edith rolled up the last of her blankets, folding them carefully into the wagon, her boy curled in the straw beside her, playing with the carved horse Callum had whittled him. "He never had a toy of his own before," Edith said, her voice low. "Not even something small." Delia didn't answer, but her eyes found Callum's across the room. He was sitting near the fire, fixing a broken strap on the saddle he'd repaired 2 days earlier. There was no need for it now, but his hands kept busy all the same. After supper, Delia stepped outside. The air bit at her cheeks. Callum followed, his coat draped over one shoulder. She didn't speak until they reached the edge of the pasture. A thin mist hung low over the grass, and the stars blinked faint through the clouded sky. "You remember what I said back when you asked if I was afraid?" she asked. "I do. I've been thinking on it. I wasn't honest." He turned toward her. "How so?" "I'm still afraid. Not of being alone, but of trusting the wrong man again. Of mistaking kindness for something else." Callum didn't move closer. He only said, "That's not foolish. I don't think you're like him, but I didn't think he was like him either. I'm not asking for your trust, Delia. I only want to be a man who earns it." She looked at him, the wind lifting strands of hair from her braid. "I don't need promises. I don't make them." They held each other's gaze, the night stretching quiet around them. Then Delia reached out and touched his hand, just lightly, her fingers brushing his. He didn't pull away. The next morning, Callum offered to help Edith drive the wagon south toward her brother's land near the Swan River. She'd written to him days earlier, and a boy from the neighboring ranch had carried the message across the valley. I'll go too, Delia said, tightening the strap across her saddlebag. Callum watched her. You sure? She nodded. I'm not one to wait in place. They left before the frost had melted, the wheels crunching over frozen mud, the horses breathing steam. Hester pressed a wrapped loaf into Delia's hands and kissed her cheek without a word. The trail bent lower into the valley, the hills rising behind them like the closing pages of a chapter. As they rode, Delia felt the weight of something shift, not fall away, but settle. Not everything had to vanish to stop hurting. Some things could just unfold into something gentler. That night, they camped near a stand of fir. The fire crackled low and the sky cleared enough to show a handful of stars. Edith and the children slept beneath the wagon. Delia sat beside Callum, her knees drawn up, a blanket draped across her shoulders. I don't know what comes next, she said. He turned his head, his voice quiet. Neither do I. She looked at him, and this time she didn't hesitate. I want to find out. Callum reached for her hand beneath the blanket, his grip warm and steady. Together, they watched the embers burn low, the night no longer something to move through, but something to share. On the fourth day of travel down the Swan River Road, the wagon reached the edge of a wide clearing hemmed by tamarack and spruce. A rail fence, patched in places with fresh pine, marked the boundary of a modest homestead tucked between two low hills. Smoke twisted from the chimney, and chickens scattered as the wagon creaked to a stop. A man in his 40s came out of the house, wiping his hands on a cloth. He had Edith's eyes, and when he spotted her stepping down with the boy in her arms, he crossed the yard in 3 long strides and pulled them both into his chest, his voice catching as he said her name. Delia stepped back, giving them room. The girl stayed close to Callum's leg, watching the unfamiliar place with her thumb hooked in her dress seam. Callum looked toward Delia. We'll stay the night. Let them settle in. She nodded. Then, depends, he said. They slept in the loft of the barn, curled in their own blankets, the scent of hay thick in the air. Rain pattered against the roof in the early hours, soft and steady. Delia listened to it with her eyes closed, her breath rising and falling in time with the hush. In the morning, Edith handed Delia a folded paper. We have a place now, she said. That's because of you. Delia tucked the paper away. You made it here. You made sure we did. Callum was outside, tightening the saddle cinch. Delia joined him, brushing her fingers along the mare's flank. You still planning to head west? She asked. No, he said. She looked up. I've been thinking, he said, adjusting the strap, about what kind of man I want to be now, not just who I've been. Delia stepped closer, her hand resting lightly on his arm. And I want to build something that lasts, something honest. He looked at her then, eyes steady. I want to do that with you. Her voice was quiet. I don't know how to begin. We don't need to, he said. We just need to start. They rode north through the low country where the river braided through stone and grass. By the time they reached the edge of the Flathead Valley, the air had turned sharp and the aspens were burning gold. They found a cabin in disrepair near the mouth of the creek. The roof needed mending, the door hung crooked, and the corral was half collapsed, but the walls were sound and the land breathed deep and open. This'll do, Callum said. Delia walked the length of the porch, her fingers trailing the rough timber. It will. They spent the next weeks rebuilding. Each morning began with coffee boiled over coals, and each evening ended with hands stained and tired. Callum repaired the roof beam by beam. Delia patched the hearth and scrubbed the floorboards bare. They slept side by side, not pressed close, but near enough that their breath mingled in the dark. One evening, after the last board was nailed to the barn's door and the chickens had settled in their roost, Callum stepped inside with a crate in his arms. Delia looked up from the bread she was kneading. What's that? He set it down on the table. A wedding gift. She raised an eyebrow. He opened the crate to reveal a hand plane, 2 chisels, and a draw knife, all cleaned and sharpened. I traded the last of the pelts for these, he said. Figured if we're building a life, I ought to have the right tools. Delia wiped her hands on her apron and stepped forward. You said wedding. He met her eyes. I did. She didn't answer right away. Then she reached up, touched the side of his face and said, "Yes." They were married beneath the cottonwoods, the creek whispering nearby. No preacher, no paper, just a vow spoken honest and quiet. She wore her mother's brooch fastened at her collar. He wore the same coat he'd had when they met, patched now at the elbow. Afterward, they walked home hand in hand, the wind lifting the leaves around them like blessings. Seasons rolled. Snow fell thick that first winter, but the cabin held warm. Callum carved wooden pegs for the new table. Delia stitched quilts from old flour sacks. In spring, she planted onions and cabbage in the garden behind the barn. He built a smokehouse with his own hands. One night, as the last of the summer storms passed overhead, Delia stood in the doorway with one hand on her belly and the other resting in Callum's. "You're not afraid?" he asked, his voice rough with wonder. "No," she said. "Not anymore." He pulled her close, his mouth at her temple. The thunder rolled distant now, fading into the hills. They stood there long after the rain stopped, listening to the wind in the grass, the creek in the dark, and the sound of their own hearts steady as the land that held them.